Okay, thank you very much. Thanks again to Dimitri and Dan for inviting me, for organising this exceptional event. I've been to lots of conferences recently where everyone agrees with me, and it's really nice to be a conference with lots of different perspectives. So I've just put this talk together yesterday, so I haven't had time to come up with a rigorous, unrefutable argument. So I thought it'd be best just to give you a brief idea of my fundamental philosophical motivation, so my fundamental reasons for approaching the issues we've been discussing as I do. And I think it could be interesting because I suspect it differs from the fundamental philosophical motivations of many other people at this conference. So I guess, in philosophy we spend a lot of time on technical arguments, and I like that, and I spend most of my time kind of very technical arguments. But I think fundamentally, probably for most philosophers, there's a big picture, right, that's really motivating you. There's some fundamental commitment that drives you that you're not going to give up on unless you really have to. And that's what's really going on behind all the technical arguments. So what I'd like to do today is just to, in very broad brushstrokes, paint you my big picture, how I see things. Okay, can I have the next slide? Okay, so my picture's very much influenced by Russell's book in 1927, The Analysis of Matter. And next slide. Shall I just do this? Eddington also wrote independently similar things. And it's sad to me that they had this really novel approach, potential solution to the mind-body problem. But it got sort of completely lost for the rest of the 20th century, mid to late. I sort of feel like it didn't fit with the zeitgeist of the 20th century, and it just got completely forgotten about. But in the 21st century, it's recently enjoying a revival. The view's become known as Russellian monism after Russell, and there's a forthcoming volume with Oxford University Press called Consciousness and the Physical World on this approach, and the papers Dave and I put in the Greenland files are going to be published there, and Dirk's got a paper there. So I think this is a really exciting revival of this approach, and for me, it's really the way forward on consciousness. Okay, next slide, please. So I want to describe you my big picture, but I'm going to start with a big picture I reject, which I'm going to call physicalism. Borrowed a word from Galen Strawson, but changed its meaning a bit. So the idea here is that roughly the lesson we should draw from the success of the physical sciences is that we should look to and only to the physical sciences to tell us what fundamental reality is like. So the idea is, the history of the physical sciences is just this history of unrelenting success, right? Explaining the movement of the planets and the evolution of life and the fundamental constituents of matter. It's just been this unstoppable juggernaut of explanation, right? And for the physicalist philosopher, what we learn from this is we found something that works, right? We finally found something we can put our ontological faith in, right? Before the scientific revolution, philosophers tried to work out what the world is like, didn't really go anywhere. Scientific revolution comes along, and it's just been success after success after success, right? So from this perspective, a philosopher who tries to look, as well as the physical sciences, to other sources is sort of old school, right? It's trying to drag us back to the 15th century, maybe equated with people who believe in magic or deny climate change or think the world was created in 7 days or something. Okay, so this is a physicalist perspective. This is not a metaphysical, this is a big picture. But it naturally leads to a metaphysical view, which I'm going to call pure physicalism. So this is the view that completed physics will give us one day the complete fundamental nature of reality. So obviously there are big problems of current physics. Our best theory of the very big, general relativity, hasn't been unified with our best theory of the very small, quantum mechanics. But the idea is, one day these problems will be ironed out, and the physicists will present us with the grand unified theory of everything, and that will be the complete fundamental nature of reality. Okay, big picture. I think this is some degree in the public mind as well. A lot of people have this picture. My worries with this picture begin from the observation upon reflection, and this is really what's fundamentally the issue for me, that the physical sciences characterize physical properties dispositionally in terms of what they do. So think about what physics tells us about electrons. This is all broad brushstrokes, sort of 15-minute talk, very rough. What does physics tell us about an electron? Well, it tells us that it has mass and negative charge. How does physics characterize mass? Very roughly, things with mass attract other things with mass and resist acceleration. This is all to do with what the electron does, right? How it behaves. How does physics characterize negative charge? Things with negative charge, very roughly, repel other things with negative charge, attract things with positive charge. Again, this is to do with what the electron does, how it behaves. So when we reflect upon the information we get from physics, we find that physics wholly characterizes an electron in terms of its behavior, in terms of what it does. And I think we have a similar picture going up the other physical sciences. So chemical elements and compounds are characterized in terms of their causal relationships with other chemical elements and compounds and their physical constituents. Brain states are characterized in neuroscience in terms of their causal relationships with other brain states and bodily or behavioral states and their chemical constituents. So we've got a sort of hierarchical system where things are being characterized in terms of what they do or what their constituents do. So we can see that pure physicalism in fact entails a metaphysical view known as dispositional essentialism. This is the view that fundamental properties are bare dispositions. That is to say, there is nothing more to the nature of a fundamental property than what it disposes its bearer to do. So if all physics tells us about electrons is what they do, and there's nothing more to an electron than what physics tells us about, it follows that there's nothing more to an electron than what it does, right? Once you know how the electron behaves, you know everything there is to know about its nature. So let me get some tea. I can't do a talk without tea. Okay, and it's this view, dispositional essentialism, which I find deeply problematic. If we could just go to the next slide. So I essentially think there are two bitter pills the dispositional essentialist must swallow. And I'm not going to, all these are big discussions, I'm not going to get into all the arguments, but give you an intuitive sense of the concerns. So the first bitter pill is that for the dispositional essentialist, fundamental entities lack an intrinsic nature. Now, the word intrinsic is used in lots of different ways by philosophers, but how I understand it, an intrinsic property is one whose instantiation concerns how the bearer is in and of itself. So if you're a pure physicalist and hence a dispositional essentialist, the nature of an electron is wholly given by how it's disposed to affect other physical entities and how it's related to other physical entities. So in that sense, there's no nature to the electron in and of itself. And I ultimately think this view is unintelligible. Okay, but the discussions are long and complicated. I mean, let me just give you the rough idea. The rough thought that's been much discussed in the literature is that in a dispositional world, so take any property, we want to know the nature of that property, we want a definition of what that property is. The definition in such a world is given in terms of a second property. Okay, so we need to know the definition of that second property, it's given in terms of a third property. What's the definition of third property, fourth property, and so on. And so the account of any property is continuously deferred and is never adequately given. So the buck is continuously passed. So the next slide is, so here's how Russell put it in the Analysis of Matter. Famously, he says, there are many possible ways of turning some things hitherto regarded as real into mere laws concerning the other things. Obviously, there must be a limit to this process, or else all the things in the world will merely be each other's washing. So there must be some things that have a nature in and of themselves. It can't be that everything is defined in terms of something else, because in such a world, nothing has an adequate definition. Just maybe, here's John Heil making a similar point. A slightly different point, actually, but a similar kind of thought. A world consisting exclusively of objects possessing dispositional properties would seem to be a world in which objects would be forever poised to act but never act. An object's acting would be a matter of its dispositions being manifested. But if a manifestation were itself nothing more than a pure disposition, a disposition to be manifested in a particular way under the right circumstances, then the situation would resemble one in which a bank check is backed by a check, which itself is backed by a check, and so on indefinitely. Unless a check is ultimately backed by something other than a check, it is worthless. And similarly, unless a disposition issues in something other than a disposition, nothing occurs. And just next slide, he just has a nice analogy for what it's worth. Imagine a row of dominoes lined up so that were the first to topple, it would topple the second domino, which would topple the third, and so on. Now imagine all there is to the dominoes is their power to topple and be toppled. It's hard to see how any toppling occurs. There are no things to topple or be toppled. Okay, next slide. So, I mean, you know, I haven't got time. It's a very complicated debate, but, you know, the starting point intuition is when we have a fundamental entity like an electron, there must be more to its nature. There must be more to its nature than what it does, or how it's related to other things. There must be some way it is in and of itself. That's the starting point intuition, but I think we can cash that out into a good argument. Okay, that's the first bitter pill. Second bitter pill, more familiar and a much more serious problem for me, is that consciousness, if you're a disposition essentialist, you have to accept that consciousness can be accounted for in entirely causal terms. Okay, so I'm not going to go, I mean, I find this deeply implausible. I'm not going to go into all the arguments. I mean, Dave, in his presented many of the familiar arguments. I actually don't quite agree with Dave's arguments. In many ways, I agreed with Paul's refutation of them. I don't agree with all of Dave's two-dimensional metasemantic assumptions. I think the arguments can be done in a slightly different way. But, you know, we're all familiar with the starting point intuition, which is that seems evident that there is a qualitative nature to conscious experience, how pain feels, how colours look, the obvious cases, and that qualitative nature can't be captured in causal terms. Okay, so this is obviously a problem for the dispositional essentialist. Now, I think these are bitter pills. I think they make a theory very implausible. But I don't think perhaps this is where I differ from Martina, I don't think they're poisonous pills, which is to say, I don't think it's impossible to have a theory which holds these things, right? I think it's very implausible, but, you know, I don't think we can know for certain these things are false. And if you're in the physicalist mindset, you know, it's the big pictures in the background, I think, and you think, you know, and you think, and you're in the physicalist mindset and you think proper respect for the history of science means, you know, we have to believe these things, then you're going to try and sweeten the pill, right? And there are ways of doing this, and I've really enjoyed listening to Dan's talks and Andy's talks and Nick's talks and Keith's talk and Dirk's chapter on the qualitative inaccuracy hypothesis and when that's been discussed. You know, and I read these things, I hear these talks, and you know, I can feel I could believe that. I could bring myself to believe it if I really had to. Right? If I really had to. They are the face of it and deeply plausible, but you know, I could bring myself to believe it if I had to. But my point, and this is the importance of the big picture, I don't think we have to. So I think there is an alternative way of understanding the history of science, and I'm going to call this post-Galileanism. So from this perspective, the reason the physical sciences have been so successful is simply that from the scientific revolution onwards, physical scientists stopped worrying about what matter is and just focused on what it does, on recording its causal structure. Right? And this is very useful information. If you have rich information about the causal structure of matter, you can manipulate the natural world in all sorts of extraordinary ways. You can build lasers and spaceships and hairdryers, and it's all great, right? Okay. And I think we've got, in the 20th century, we've just got so overwhelmed by how well the physical sciences have gone and the incredible technology it's brought us that we've thought, oh, this is everything. This is what we've got to put our faith in. But for what it's worth, I don't think the original pioneers of the physical sciences, Galileo and Newton, saw it that way at all. I think the proper way of thinking is that the reason the physical sciences have been so successful is precisely because they're only giving us a limited picture of reality. They stopped trying to tell us what matter is, and they just focused on telling us what it does. So I think we can be thankful for the success of science while appreciating the physical sciences, science can get complicated, whilst appreciating that it's giving us only a limited but very useful picture of reality. And then we don't have to swallow the bitter pills. We can accept that there is an intrinsic nature to matter that goes beyond the causal structure physical science has revealed to us, and the qualities we find in consciousness are part of that intrinsic nature. So this is now the Russellian Eddingtonian explanation of consciousness. So the idea is conscious states are brain states, but they are the intrinsic nature of the brain that goes beyond the causal structure we get from neuroscience. So neuroscience just tells us what the brain does, what its parts do, but there is an intrinsic nature to the brain. And that intrinsic nature is, at least in part, involves the qualities of consciousness, the qualitative experience. That's the intrinsic nature of the brain. And, I just think I can't see the losing side to this view. It seems unified, economical, no clash with science, makes sense of mental causation. Don't have to swallow those bitter pills. So this is the way forward for me. So finally, I think from this post-Galilean perspective, the history of metaphysics is divided into two epochs. So the pre-Galilean epoch, when philosophers just tried to capture the complete nature of reality, didn't go so well. The Galilean epoch, when there was we decided, well, physical science is just going to capture the causal structure of reality. That's gone really well. But of course, from my view, it was never in the business of giving us a complete account of matter. But in the post-Galilean viewpoint, we can look forward to a third epoch. It's the final slide. A third epoch of metaphysics, right, where we take the rich information about causal structure that we have from the physical sciences, but we also take the information about intrinsic nature we have via our acquaintance with consciousness, and we take these as both equal sources of data to be accounted for. And we try to work out the most elegant, unified, parsimonious theory which accounts for both these sources of data. And I think if we seriously engaged with that project, we could perhaps even get consensus on what I think would be the best guess humans are capable of what reality is like. And it's very early days, but I think panpsychism looks to be the most plausible contender at this stage. So I think people have this, worry metaphysics doesn't seem to have got anywhere, but I think that's because we haven't started yet, right? Maybe we had to wait till natural science was a significant level of maturity. So I just look forward to a day when philosophers can move on from what I see as the understandable but misguided over-enthusiasm for the physical sciences, and we can start, perhaps for the first time in history, to start doing metaphysics properly and see where it goes.
That's wonderfully clear and vivid and eloquent, Philip. Thank you very much. I see lots of hands, and I see in the back first.
Philip, thank you very much for your presentation. I think that there probably is a problem with attributing any intrinsic qualities to such things as electrons, protons, and other particles. Look, these particles form a different way and in different circumstances without any impact. In one case, they form it acts like a particle. In other circumstances, it acts like an electromagnetic wave. So, doesn't it make problems for your interpretation that it has one stable quality?
I'd like to hear more about why exactly wave-particle duality would be inconsistent. But actually, just to be clear, the talk I've just given now was not a talk supporting panpsychism. It was a talk supporting an approach, right? An approach that takes introspective data about the nature of consciousness and from the physical sciences equally. And some people, and Sam Coleman, he finds panpsychism absurd, and he takes this in another direction. So it's not that this entails panpsychism. You know, we don't even to certain forms of dualism or idealism. I mean, I just find panpsychism looks to be the most, on the face of it, the most sort of straightforward and parsimonious way of spelling it. And you know, lots of people think, you know, there could be arguments of what is involved in conscious experience. Some people think it's essentially representational in a very sophisticated way, that it's absurd to attribute it to a fundamental particle. I'm inclined to just think there is some very general determinable category captured by the Nagel expression, what it's like, that there's something that it's like to be. So there's no conceptual bar to attributing consciousness to an electron. But so why would the fact that it's wave-particle duality be...
The particle, the supposed electron changes its properties without any input. So it doesn't experience any input from other particles or from, I don't know, forces, whatever. It just changes properties when we change the point of view.
So maybe it changes consciousness. I don't know. Why would that be a problem for attributing consciousness to it?
Well, that was my question to you.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting. I've actually never thought about that. I'll have to think about that. I mean, for start, how to understand quantum mechanics is extremely controversial. And for a start, I mean, you know, the many worlds interpretation, we don't have collapses the wave function and so on. I'll think about that. That's a very interesting point.
Yeah, just to clarify your point, as I understand, physics looks at electrons as fundamentally the same, you know, entities. So, do you think that each electron has a different intrinsic nature, or they also have the same intrinsic nature?
I'd be inclined to.
And how do you tell? Like, maybe it's the same electron. So there's one electron with one intrinsic nature with superposition. I don't, you know, how do you like?
Well, we do the work and we look to the thing. I mean, I've been inclined to look to physics in the first instance, and it, as you said, seems from the physics perspective that they do seem to have the same nature in the sense that they behave in the same way. As far as I know, I'm not a physicist. There might be, but we've got another thing to account for, right? The evident reality of consciousness, and we need to incorporate the two. Maybe it might be reason to postulate distinct intrinsic entries to natures to electrons. I don't know. I mean, that would just come out in the theory. I mean, I don't have a worked out theory of. There is a great paper called "What's It Like to Be a Quark" by my fellow panpsychist Pat Lutus. But yeah, I mean, look, this would panpsych. So this, I guess,
it's really interesting. I guess I'm following with Keith's line somehow. How would you tell what would be the intrinsic nature of the electron? I understand that your evidence, your evidence is consciousness, and but you know how. Tom Nagel probably couldn't write a paper saying what it's like to be an electron, but and then was been experimenting with questions how to be a thermostat, but from a different perspective. But how would you what is the research program?
Right, what is the research program? One of my favorite examples, why Einstein's special relativity, theory of special relativity, relative to the Lorentzian theory which preceded it. As far as I'm aware, open to correction here, they are empirically equivalent, right? They both account for the datum that the speed of light is observed to be the same in all frames of reference. The difference is Einstein had a much simpler, elegant interpretation of that datum, and that's why the scientific community universally went for Einstein's theory. And in fact, what was driving Einstein's special relativity, again, as I understand it, open to be corrected, I mean, with special relativity, he wasn't out going experiments. What he wanted to do was bring greater unity to physics, right? He saw that there was a principle of relativity in older science of mechanics, and there was no principle of relativity in the new science of electromagnetism. So he thought, that's not very pretty. We need a principle of relativity in both. So, I mean, so one fundamental way we do science, Jesse talked a lot about, we need to fit the data. That's one aspect of science, right? We fit data. But certainly in the more theoretical ends of science, we look for theoretical elegance, virtue, fittingness. So the methodology is, look, we take these two sources of data and we try to formulate our best theory that accounts for both forms of data, the most elegant theory that accounts for both forms of data. I mean, I'm not there yet. I don't have a worked out theory. And look, and I'm one more thing. I mean, I'm open to some humility here. I think, and again, it's being caught in this physicalist way of thinking about things. I think we've been so impressed by the success of the physical sciences that we think, overconfident about what we can achieve. That we're going to, there's no reason to think we can't get all of it. And, I mean, the Church's book, it's you naysayers if you're pessimistic. But I think that's only because we stopped trying to tell us what matter was and we just focused on causal structure. That's why it became easier, in a sense, although it's still incredibly hard. So I'm open to the idea that we might never be able to get all the details, right? Maybe we'll just be able to know that panpsychism in some general form is the most reasonable speculation. Maybe we won't be able to fill in the details. Maybe, I'm not like McGinn that I definitely know we can't, and I'm going to give it my best go. But, some people like Sam Coleman I mentioned earlier, think we're really going to get there and we're really going to get a positive theory. And, I'm up for going about that in the way I've just explained. But I'm open to the possibility that naturally evolved creatures are not able to get at all the details of how the world is. Why should that be the case? In a way, given that we're the products of natural selection, it's more likely to think we're not going to get the details. But
just make something clear to me, just sort of logically. I had never thought of the manifestation of a disposition as another disposition. The sugar sitting in the box is not melting. So it's on the face of it, we've got things with dispositions and manifestations of dispositions. We've also got spatial location. I'm also not clear about the intrinsic-extrinsic distinction. What's wrong with a picture of a thing that in and of itself just does all these different things in certain circumstances? There's the dispositions, the manifestations, and maybe that's all there is. I mean, maybe the things can be identified in terms of their spatial location. What's wrong with this picture? I mean, you just assume the manifestations are dispositions. That just seems, on the face of it, flatly false.
Okay, so I have, for sake of time, massively oversimplified things. You're right, there's a different distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic and dispositional and categorical, and Dirk's notion of absolutely intrinsic properties, and spatiotemporal properties. But as to the more specific point you made about why equate the manifestation of a disposition with another disposition, well, I'm considering the position where every property is a disposition.
But why on earth believe that?
Because
I'm not a philosopher of science, but having studied physics at high school and college, and so I never in my life would have thought that physics is just describing dispositions. There's also things moving through spaces.
Right. Okay. So you're talking about spatiotemporal properties. Okay. So
not just spatial.
What's
changes in mass, changes in energy, changes in.
I think
change itself a disposition? It may be manifesting a disposition, but it isn't itself a disposition. Or at least we need an argument that it is.
If you're talking about things like mass and energy, I think when you reflect, they to certain extent they can feel.
No, the change in the mass, not the mass. Change in mass, change in energy, change in temperature, change in position.
But what is changes
the event, not the.
Yeah, but changes. An event is that involves changes moving from one property to another property. Tell me the property that comes about that's not dispositional.
Itself is not the disposition.
Andy.
So I guess I've got a conceptual problem here, and you can just move me along in it. So if you go looking for something like a Higgs boson, you go looking for something that is defined by its behavior. It seems to me that what science does, what thought does, is it creates models of the world. Those models are populated by entities, but those entities seem to be constantly defined by what they do. Yeah. So I don't actually know how to go about looking for the nature of something, apart from seeing whether there's a pattern like that in what's being done, the pattern that seems to define the entity. I just don't see what else to do. How can you, don't you just get left with the pure mental stuff in some way? If you take your route, you can never get at the intrinsic nature of matter. Maybe you can get the intrinsic nature of the mental because you kind of got it already or something, but that still doesn't help us do much.
One thing I could say is quote Patricia Churchill's book that, here's a fallacious argument. We can't imagine how we're going to do it, so, it's going to be impossible. It seems to me like, that in one way I can hear it like that, I mean, but I mean, I can. Well, look,
But there's no reason to embark on a research program with no idea how you can do it.
there is a reason to vote, but because to avoid swallowing those two bitter pills, right?
Dirk.
I actually have a follow-up. I have a similar question to Andy's. Here's one way of putting it. So maybe the thought that here's a thought. We do in fact have a grasp of straightforwardly physical, non-dispositional categorical properties. It's just an illusion of a certain sort that we don't. So, and the reason is that there's only two ways for us to specify to explicate knowledge of straightforwardly physical properties. One is dispositionally, and the other is in terms of constitution into more fundamental properties. There's really two ways. Now, if they're fundamental properties, you're not going to be able to do B, right? That's not possible. And so all that's really left is dispositional characterization. That's not going to satisfy you. Okay, so take Locke for example. Locke says, look, the fundamental categorical nature of matter is what he calls solidity, which is the categorical basis of absolute impenetrability. Yeah. Okay, and you say, well, what's it like? Well, the thing is, there are only two things you can do, right? Analyze it into more fundamental properties, and that's by definition impossible, or do the dispositional thing, which isn't going to satisfy you. Yeah. Okay, but so what's your argument that Locke is wrong with it? We don't have some sort of grasp of categorical solidity.
What meaning? You mean the Lockean notion of fundamental solidity?
That's right. Yeah, which is categorical based.
Okay, I mean.
Impenetrability.
Yeah, I mean that's not a hypothesis that. I mean, I would entirely want to dismiss from someone working with this kind of methodology. I mean,
he says, look, we do have these immediate grasp, perhaps, of, at least in your view, of mental categorical properties. And so you're really just prejudicing the whole inquiry in favor of categorical mental properties by not admitting the Lockean possibility.
I mentioned panpsychism once. I mean, I've given a very, very general framework, taking the essence of the framework is we've got two sources of data here. We've got two things we know are real, consciousness and dispositional structure, and we have to somehow work out the best way of putting them together. That's the starting point. And panpsychism is what looks very straightforward and on the face. But I mean, other options. I mean, I take an option that did involve some kind of primitive notion of Lockean solidity. If that was involved in some such theory, I don't think that would be, maybe it would be slightly against the letter of what I've just said, but I think that could be in the same spirit. I mean, the kind of views you talk about in your book. I mean, personally myself, I'm inclined to be an illusionist about Lockean solidity, like Hume thinks we have, I just think we've got a notion of solidity, but there's really nothing there. But I don't have any arguments. But the main point is, yeah, I mean, I think an approach that involved that might very well fit with the kind of framework I'm talking about.
Nick?
First, Philip, a wonderful demonstration of the motivational power of consciousness. I love seeing your passion there. And, Andy was saying, whatever reason it is to think that one of the roles of consciousness is to motivate people to act in new ways. But what I really wanted to come back to was just to remind you of two quotations from your hero, Bertrand Russell. I'm not going to get them exactly right, but in one he said, I wish to commend to the reader a doctrine so radical that I expect it will never be accepted, and it's that we should not believe in a theory for which there is absolutely no evidence to believe that it's true. That's one. The other one is he said that the habit of postulating fundamental properties in order to explain what we want to explain has many advantages. They are the advantages of theft over honest time. I wonder what Russell would have actually made of your talk.
I think Russell in 1927 at least would have completely agreed. Read Analysis of Matter and it's evident. And it's incredible to me that people have forgotten this about Russell. But I mean, just to reasons...
Charity.
What we have, talking about reason to believe, look, everybody has their starting points. If you think I'm not going to go beyond experience, you're not going to get further than solipsism. You're not going to be able to trust your memory. Everybody has certain starting points, and this is where a certain sort of physicalism often assumes that, they're not making any starting points, they're just going to science. But, to start science, you need to assume there's an external world, you need to assume there are other minds, perhaps you need to assume the future will resemble the past, right? What seems to me a very good starting point is, I'm conscious. Like, I'm in agony that there is a certain way that feels. I mean, that seems to me a very good starting point for thinking. In fact, it's more evident. I think Descartes was right that those kind of things are more evident than the external world even. So, yeah, I mean, I don't see why you feel a certain pressure that we've got to overcome those intuitions. That you might be right. That I might be under an illusion, but I might be in the matrix. And I think it's an ideology basically, because we've become so impressed with technology, and that we've thought, we've got to basically deny consciousness. And I think in 100 years' time we'll look back and think that was a really odd period of history where all these people were on a boat arguing there was no consciousness. Yeah, I really do.
So Philip, first of all, I want to agree with Andy. These pills aren't bitter at all. They're quite tasty. I mean, really.
Well, listen,
really, they're tasty, and they're tasty for a very good reason. Is that they are part of a research program which is multifarious, multi-stranded, with all sorts of things in the offing, and we know how to go about doing it. And the trouble with your postulation of intrinsic properties is that, as a number of people have suggested, an intrinsic property seems to be systematically elusive. Nothing could be evidence for it, because whatever evidence you find is just going to be another manifestation of another disposition. And if intrinsic properties are not discovered by what they do, then they're not discoverable at all. So you end up postulating an intrinsic property to conscious states, an intrinsic property to matter, and talk about theft versus honest toil. The research program is over. There is nothing more to ask. There's no questions to ask. There's nothing could count as an answer, because an evidence would have to be evidence of another dispositional property.
Okay, I want to say two things. Firstly, whenever I talk about consciousness to Wittgensteinians, they always say, but you're left with skepticism about other minds. As though a theory that ends up with having that problem, it must be wrong. I just think, well, I do. That's a shame. I think that's the human epistemic situation, that we have this epistemic difficulty knowing whether that's just the human situation. I'm not. Now it seems I hear what you're saying. You're saying like physical science is great, right? So it should be able to count for everything. I mean, maybe the world's not perfect. Maybe it would be great if we could get at the intrinsic nature of matter with the sort of precision and interpersonal testing. I was having this argument with Keith on the first day. It would be great if we could, but if we can't, that's the human situation. I don't think we should rule out a view because. It's almost like you're saying it's a view I'd like to believe. It's a view I'd like to. You're saying to me, it sounds like you're saying the view would like to believe.
All the stuff we can do looks just the same, though.
But I'm not.
Nothing changed in the realm of what we can do.
Your alternative program has no first or second step to it. There's nowhere to
2 points. Let me repeat how the methodological program. I mean, there is lots we can do. We can do neuroscience, we can do psychophysics, we can correlate conscious states with brain states, we can try and analyze conscious states in more fundamental terms. There's a great PhD student in Toronto trying to make sense of conscious states being made up of kind of simpler experiences. We can look for commonalities between neural structures, and we can do all this. Trying to make sense of the intrinsic nature of simpler forms of matter in terms of what we know about from consciousness in our own case. So I think there is a rich methodological way forward here. Now, but the second point, I suspect it won't be as good as natural science. It won't work as well because for the reason interpersonal testing is that these properties are quite elusive. I don't think maybe we might get to a point where there are certain hypotheses left that we can't rule out, and we just have to say this is the best guess we can have. I suspect it'll be like that. But again, I think there is a way forward, and we should try it. If it ends up not getting as far as we'd like, then I just say that's the way things are. That's what we're naturally evolved creatures. Why should we expect that we're going to be able to get all the details of how the universe works?
How can you tell if a particular step you take in your research program is wrong?
How did we know that special relativity is better than Lorentz's view?
Well, we had a more powerful and simpler theory.
Exactly, so it'd be like that.
Well, but can you
That's it.
fill that out with any?
It is.
Yeah.
Well,
What we would like to hear
it's going to be.
is some gap of ignorance that's closed by taking this other method. Something that's been that we physicalists have been scratching our heads about and despairing that we don't have the theory. And you folks come along and say, but look, we can predict this.
If you're asking for the kind of data, a better explanation of the kind of data you want explained, then I don't think that's going to happen precisely because you're just dealing with one set of data, and we're trying to deal with which. Look, as I agree with Dave that the neuroscience is philosophically neutral. So it's we're engaged with the same project as doing the neuroscience, but we're also trying to do something else. We're also trying to speculate to some degree at the best way of colouring in that causal structure that we're both interested in uncovering. We're both interested in, think of it like this, we're all on a project together of getting the black and white causal structure, but people like me are on another project of trying to speculate, how it's probably coloured in. And, and the way it's going to be something like metaphysics. It's going to involve empirical science, but it's also going to be something like metaphysics. Trying to argue about what theories are more or less arbitrary, what theories are more simple or coherent. I have arguments about, some people think, it makes sense for qualities to be, qualia to exist unexperienced. There's one debate about coherence there. But, I'd say, come back to the example of special relativity again. I think there's no empirical thing there. It was a move in terms of elegance, and so some moves are going to be like that.
I'm not sure you're directly addressing, I thought Dan's fundamental point was all of the data are dispositions. Yeah. And so you've got to say something. You've got to say something about that, I think.
Yeah, but that's not all the data. Right, that's not all the data.
Well, so give us an example of a datum that isn't just dispositions.
Consciousness, that's the point. That's the other datum.
How do you know the information you have about consciousness is how do you know that what you're disposed to say about it? You have to sort of do the introspective. You have to pay attention to it. And I always ask me what's my knowledge. I have to report it. I have to sort of think about it and say, well, it's like this, it's kind of like this. How do I know that's accurate? I mean, we seem to be giving you the first person data for free. Well, I don't think we have the first person data for free.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that was the question. How do we get?
How do I know it's getting at the relevant, a collection of bits in my very intrinsic nature of the relevant bits? Maybe it's getting at a tiny bit. It's getting at a big. I don't know.
I would do it the same way you do it. I would. Obviously, listen. There is no doubt that we get our conscious experience wrong in certain respects, and there are lots of interesting empirical findings that we get out right. I don't think it follows from that we get conscious experience wrong in all respects. So I would explore consciousness in exactly the same way. I would do psychophysics. I would look at the brain. But the only difference is, I think. Whatever we find out about I think the very general determinable of consciousness is qualitative, and so no matter how wrong we are about consciousness, unless we're eliminativist about it, there's going to be another datum here.
Do you think there's any access that I have to my intrinsic qualities that is not mediated by some sort of causal process?
Yes.
You do.
Yes, I believe in acquaintance.
And what are the two terms? Like one is the qualitative dimension. Who's the subject that's having access to it? On the other hand,
I think subjects are involved in a very special relationship with the where's Martina? Experiential properties called acquaintance, which is, I think consciousness involves an intrinsic kind of self-representation.
And with an causally unmediated relation.
Yeah. No, look,
Sorry,
I haven't argued for that, I've just stated that, but yeah.
Yeah, I think you need to say that, yes. And I think it's important you say that to make it very clear.
So why is that vital to the project, though?
I mean, it looks like you're going to something heavily dualistic about subjects to me.
Doesn't look very naturalistic.
It gives you a project which you can seem to have, but what are you going to do with that?
Hold on. What do you mean by naturalistic?
Well,
That is a word.
a direct personal access to an intrinsic property seems like a rabbit pulled out of a hat. It just doesn't seem to bear any relationship to any other kind of evidence we have. Now, if you insist on it and you just say, well, there's all the other evidence we have, and then we have direct, unmediated, and perhaps incorrigible access to intrinsic properties of our experience, I mean, that's a fairly big mouthful. I don't think do you really want to go that route?
I'm not sure what the essential difficulty. I mean, it's beyond a rhetorical point, or I mean, but look, that's not the starting point, right? The starting point, the motivation is the standard anti-physicalist arguments, right?
It's a starting point because implicit in first-person data. You can't just help yourself to that without taking on the commitments.
The starting point is the anti-physicalist arguments, which, well, just let me say, the anti-physicalist arguments which lead us to the conclusion, I think, that consciousness cannot be accounted for in purely causal terms. So then we can either be eliminativists, and you agree with those arguments, right? Or but there's a further question here: how do we make sense of our relationship to phenomenal qualities? And that needs spelling out. I happen to favour an acquaintance model that I've argued for at great length, and I haven't said that here. Other people don't, right? Sam Coleman, I've mentioned the third time now, just thinks the notion of acquaintance is ridiculous for the reasons you've said. There has to be... So that's not an essential part of this starting point. So I think maybe these two things, the very general starting point, which is sort of refusing to swallow those two bitter pills and saying, I feel no pressure to swallow those two bitter pills.
I don't think that's your... I'm not sure that's your starting point. I mean, isn't your starting point that there third-person data, which might be roughly the causal dispositional stuff.
Yeah.
But also there are introspective data, which are not the causal dispositional stuff.
Right.
I mean, and someone like Keith or Dan could put forward the radical view that, in fact, we ought to reconstruct those first-person data as something dispositional. But I think, even someone like Keith or Dan will say, well, that's actually a radical and counterintuitive view that comes with a lot of cost. So that's where your starting point was. We don't have to pay that cost. So we don't need to make that move, and that seems to be before all the anti-physicalist arguments. I mean, there are these introspective data, which are not dispositional data.
I would say the starting point is that we are aware of consciousness, and it can't be accounted for in purely causal terms. That would be the starting point.
What are starting points? Are starting points to give up the bowl in the light of theorizing?
Say again?
Are starting points give up the bowl or revisable in the light of theorizing, or are starting points like fixed for you? Like when you start with this thing, you theorize for a while, because you at that point say, my starting point is a bad one, I'm going to give it up. Is that possible for you?
Interesting question. I mean, the methodology I've set up has these two data to be respected. Now, here's an interesting question. Could there be could one of the data look like it eliminates the other?
Right.
I guess in some way, maybe this is where I disagree with Martina. I guess I'm kind of open to that. If there was an incredible empirical argument that consciousness was an illusion.
Actually, a credible empirical.
Sorry. I meant incredible in the
We have
sense
some
of...
incredible ones.
If there was a marvellous empirical argument, I might be prepared to be an illusionist about consciousness. If there was, and vice versa, maybe I'd be prepared to be an idealist. If there was I'd be much more open to idealism, to be honest. But, so there are, from the physicalist perspective, it's almost like there is some pressure in respecting the history of science to think, we have to get rid of these intrinsic properties. They're weird as down to their rabbits out of hats. They're naturally. I think that's an ideological viewpoint that comes out of a mischaracterization of why science is successful. Yeah. So
I can't help pointing out that I can't remember who you were quoting. The person who said that it's like you have a check, who is it?
Heil.
It seems as if he's falling off his own cliff there, because Is he calling for a return to the gold standard and intrinsic economic value? We know that dispositions is all there is to money and checks and so forth. So it's a very good example of how you get rid of how, as we mature as a science, we get rid of the idea of an intrinsic property. We say the idea of intrinsic value is just magic. It's nonsense. We don't need a notion of intrinsic value. We thought we did. We don't.
Okay, that's good. Well, you've just persuaded me that his metaphor is badly chosen. But look, these are just metaphors, and you know, I think we can cash out a good argument that a world where there are just dispositions is just unintelligible.
So that's a very good session. Thank you.
Thank you.